project, and I'd like to welcome all of you here. Today's book discussion is co-organized by the History and Public Policy program at the Woodrow Wilson Center and its Cold War International History Project, together with the Atomic Heritage Foundation. For those of you unfamiliar with the Cold War International History Project, I see a lot of new faces here. Let me say a couple of words about it. The project supports the full and prompt release of historical materials by governments on all sides of the Cold War and seeks to accelerate the process of integrating new sources, materials, and perspectives from the former communist bloc in the historiography of the Cold War. It seeks to transcend barriers of language and geography to create new links among scholars interested in Cold War history. As part of our mission here at the center, we organize book discussions like the one today on new research in Cold War history. Many of the books featured here at the project are new research that integrate the records, archival documents from the former communist world. However, as most, if not all, historians will tell you, documents are not the end-all, be-all of historical research. I might actually get in trouble for saying that here at the project, but it's true. The book we're discussing today, the Manhattan Project, which, by the way, it's available for sale outside, brings to life, proves that personalities matter and that people make a difference. It brings to life the people involved in the project that basically changed, if not the face of the world, at least the face of warfare. It's a collection of interviews, excerpts from books and articles that paints a fascinating picture of the project to get the atom bomb, as well as the people behind it. We have an extraordinary panel here today. I want to welcome them to the center. Right next to me is Cynthia Kelly, who is the founder and president of the Atomic Heritage Foundation, our partners in this book discussion. She was previously a senior executive with the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency and is a recipient of the Distinguished Career Service Award. She is the editor of the book we're discussing today, which was published in 2007. We also are joined by William Lanawy, who has written extensively on the politics of nuclear weapons and nuclear power. He was Washington correspondent for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist before joining the U.S. General Accounting Office in '91, from which he retired recently. He is the author of Genius in the Shadows, a biography of Leo Szilard. Sorry. The Man Behind the Bomb, which was published first in '92 and then in '94. We're also joined by Robert Furman, as a retired major in the Army Corps of Engineers. After working for General Leslie Groves at the Pentagon, he joined him in August 1943 to lead the first atomic intelligence unit. Under the Alamos program, he helped uncover the German bomb effort, recovering uranium ore, equipment, and eventually capturing the German scientists themselves. Last but certainly not least, we are joined by James Hirschberg, who many of the people familiar with the Cold War Project know very well. He is associate professor of history and international affairs at George Washington University. He is the author of James B. Conant, Harvard to Hiroshima and the Making of the Nuclear Age, published in '93 and '95. His recent scholarship focused on the Cold War and nuclear issues, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, the Vietnam War, Afghanistan wars, Iran-Contra affairs, researching communist archives, etc. He is also the first director of the Cold War International History Project. I want to welcome all of you here to the center again, and I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia to get the discussion started. Thank you. I just want to remind all of you that we're webcasting this event live, and please wait for the microphone and identify yourself when asking questions at the end. Thank you. Cynthia.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming today and braving the snow. Although I will say there's no one in this room who is more brave with snow than the man sitting next to me, who last December 5th, braved a snowstorm and 10 accidents on I-270 to participate in an event we had to dedicate the offices of General Groves that were just rediscovered as part of the State Department. It took him 4.5 hours to get here from on I-270, and he persisted. And he agreed to be on this panel only if there was no snow. So I told him I was going to put him up at the Ritz or drive him home myself. But I'm so grateful. This is a great treat. One thing that is a certainty is that the Manhattan Project happened 65 years ago. If you count 1943 as a year when they began to move into Los Alamos and really get serious about building the B reactor at Hanford and the other plants at Oak Ridge. And the Manhattan Project was a very young crew, but even with 65 years on top of 15, it's still a high number. And we are very, very grateful to have Bob Furman with us today. We're also really very happy to have two colleagues of mine. I say colleagues because I have enlisted both of them in several different events, and most recently in this anthology, which we came out with, which is sort of the prompt for this session. This anthology is testament that you can do anything with help from your friends. And we had really the best group of advisors, two Pulitzer Prize winners, Richard Rhodes and Kai Bird, Bill Lanawy, Andrew Brown, who's a British historian, and Stan Norris, who wrote a biography of General Groves. And Jim contributed his article. But as Bill will testify, they rolled their sleeves up. And this document represents 80 to 100 years of research. Reflected in the number of years that they each, these advisors, put into it, and they made sure it has the right stuff. There's nothing missing. That's really significant. But the best part, as some would say, or I'd say a complementary, very fine feature of this anthology, is it has a lot of first-hand accounts. We have taken oral histories from over 100 veterans and larded the book with snippets that hopefully help you get a sense of what life was like in those times. Obviously, the Manhattan Project has not left us. Word of the weapons issues around the world is on the front page every day or every other day. The legacy of the Manhattan Project is real and immediate. And I think we're fortunate today to have some of the nation's experts with us to talk about that. We're going to do this in a very informal way. This is a small room and a good group of people. We're going to let each speaker talk about 15 minutes, and then we're going to have a little give and take among the panelists, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. So hold on to your questions. We'll have a lot of time for a question and answer. So without further ado, I want to say maybe one thing just about our mission. The Atomic Heritage Foundation not only is into publications, but we're trying to preserve the physical reality of the Manhattan Project and actually preserve the properties. And we have one champion of that effort from Hanford, from Richland here, Pam Brown, who has been working hard along with a wonderful coalition in Washington State to preserve the B reactor, which is sort of the first plutonium production reactor there. And we're working to preserve the K-25 gaseous diffusion reactor in Oak Ridge. Had a wonderful public meeting last night, and a year ago dedicated the first Manhattan Project property to be preserved at Los Alamos. This is no easy thing because they were all slated for demolition. It's not that, they were going to be preserved anyway. This has really been the classic historic preservation struggle. But at any rate, we're pleased with that, and I just wanted to invite you to pick up one of our annual reports and brochures and find out more about what we're doing on the web, and invite you to join us. At any rate, thank you for being here, and we're going to start with Bill Lanawy to sort of set the stage for the Manhattan Project and talk a little bit about the struggles early on in the early Cold War years.
Thank you, Cindy. Excuse me for reading from prepared notes, but I find that I'm less long-winded that way. I can stick to the script. What is the Manhattan Project? Well, technically, it's a secret federal program begun in June of 1942 that cost, in today's terms, about $20 billion, and by August 1945 had produced and exploded 3 nuclear weapons and created the capacity to expand weapons production after World War II. But no matter how defined, the Manhattan Project is an effort remembered most for its stunning blend of theoretical science and industrial strength technology, its ability to turn the concept of nuclear weapons into a reality with unprecedented speed. There is a certain triumphalism and hubris surrounding the Manhattan Project for the way it helped end the war. But as you know, historians differ on what motives drove the Manhattan Project scientists to build the A-bomb and on what role their creation played in Japan's surrender. Putting those questions aside, there is still some triumphalism and hubris about American know-how and determination. Bob Alvarez has talked about the 3 M's of the 20th century: the Manhattan Project, the Marshall Plan, and the moon landing. All 3 offer grand examples of concerted federal efforts on specific missions. Yet of the 3, the Manhattan Project holds a special fascination because what it created haunts us to this day and still affects our lives and our security. There is the example, leading politicians to call for a new Manhattan Project on everything from eradicating poverty to rebuilding our cities to fighting disease. And there is the legacy, leading politicians to assume that the Manhattan Project is a good model for government action. But is it? The only successful example of the Manhattan Project approach that I can think of is the nuclear navy. And the only common thread between the two, aside from harnessing nuclear energy, is that they both shared 3 key elements. They were run by autocrats, in secret, with unlimited budgets. General Leslie R. Groves and Admiral Hyman G. Rickover were both rigorous taskmasters with urgent missions that required ingenious, sometimes ruthless, management techniques. Both tried to read every report and memo in their reach, and in the name of national security, both were allowed to succeed on their own terms. But how applicable are those terms to the challenges of today? Will a new Groves or Rickover emerge to fight terrorism or forge a workable healthcare system or forestall global climate change? I think not, for 2 reasons. First, what Groves and Rickover achieved was essentially technical and mechanical and thrived outside the pressures of American politics. Second, their goals were limited to creating an empire and running it within existing military organizations. Both pursued finite missions, and both were sidelined once their enterprises grew. In fact, I think the Manhattan Project succeeded as much by luck as by leadership. If several crucial breaks had not occurred and the first nuclear weapons would not have been ready by the end of World War II and may not have even worked. What if Enrico Fermi and Leo Szilard had not met at Columbia University in January 1939, just as nuclear fission was announced? Both fleeing fascism, they were the 2 physicists in the world most likely to create the nuclear chain reaction. And that summer they did co-design the first neutronic reactor, as they called it, a machine they successfully tested in Chicago 3 years later. What if Szilard had not recognized that only pure graphite can moderate or slow down neutrons in a chain reaction? Commercial graphite, he found, contains boron that absorbs neutrons and chokes off the process. German scientists failed to see that, tried the more cumbersome heavy water moderator, and never built an operating reactor by the war's end. What if Fermi and Szilard had been denied federal funding in 1940 for their research at Columbia? An Army investigation that spring concluded from highly reliable sources that both men should be denied security clearances, concluding Fermi was undoubtedly a fascist and Szilard was very pro-German. The Army decided of each man, quote, employment of this person on secret work is not recommended. Although the only secret work then underway in this country was taking place in the minds of Fermi and Szilard. Had their collaboration been stalled in 1940, it is certain that the first reactor would not have operated by December 42, and the first nuclear weapons would not have been ready by August 45. What if the Manhattan Project had not been infiltrated by Martians? That was the nickname of 4 Hungarian refugee scientists because they were superhumanly intelligent and spoke an unearthly language. Eugene Wigner, Leo Szilard, John von Neumann, and Edward Teller all played decisive roles in nuclear developments during and after the war. For example, it was Wigner and Szilard who solved the problem of xenon poisoning that had fouled plutonium production at Hanford, and von Neumann's mathematical genius helped devise the implosion bomb when in 1944 it was discovered that the plutonium could not be detonated using the gun design that would work with uranium. After the war, Szilard concluded that the most powerful weapon to result from the Manhattan Project was not the A-bomb, it was the secret stamp. That secrecy kept the American public and elected officials from examining the legacy of the Manhattan Project for years, and from examining the awesome post-war challenges posed by the bomb. That secrecy also stifled Manhattan Project scientists, who tried both during and after the war to have a voice in how their creations were used. That secrecy allowed Louis Strauss and Edward Teller to use security in 1954 as a way to ruin J. Robert Oppenheimer. And I commend to your attention an excellent book by Priscilla McMillan on that subject. That secrecy and the Cold War fears it nurtured also allowed billions of dollars to be wasted by Los Alamos and Livermore national labs on duplicate or redundant research. Now, they had a good model here because it was Groves who tried every way he could simultaneously to enrich uranium, but that, I think, was a slightly different situation. Another Manhattan Project legacy is the way federal funding has come to dominate all scientific research. Before World War II, science was supported by corporations, universities, wealthy investors, and foundations, rarely by the federal government. Finally, with the Manhattan Project model in mind, the Atomic Energy Commission created a system of 9 national laboratories now run by contractors for the Energy Department. 5 were built at Manhattan Project sites: Argonne, Berkeley, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Pacific Northwest at Hanford. The others are Brookhaven, Idaho, Livermore, and Sandia. These labs employ tens of thousands of scientists and engineers in diverse activities. Sometimes called miracles in the desert, they have contributed to many American scientific advances and fostered several Nobel Prizes. This week, for example, we read that 2 Los Alamos scientists have a plan to turn carbon dioxide into fuel. I think it's curious, however, that these announcements seem to come out about the time the budgets are being reviewed on Capitol Hill. But anyway, they are still turning out some miracles in the deserts. But with the AEC's demise in the 1970s and the end of its central focus on nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, the labs have lost direction and coordinated purpose. DOE wields little control over its labs' priorities, and their missions have meandered. With the Cold War's end, some lawmakers have wondered if we need 3 nuclear weapons labs. But we still have 3, in part because they generate jobs, in part because they are not part of an integrated and directed network, something the old GAO used to complain about all the time. Over the years, the labs have pursued various missions: the nuclear arms race, then economic competitiveness, then environmental research, then energy innovation, then supercomputers, of which each lab had to have its own, you remember, then the human genome, then new nuclear weapons, and now the fight against terrorism. While the national labs have much to boast about, there is also much to forget. There was the nuclear airplane, whose rusty remains now sit in the Idaho desert. There was the breeder reactor, developed for an energy future that was to include, by now, 1,000 nuclear power plants and 100 breeders to fuel them. And there was Star Wars. These and other boondoggles were driven by the hubris spawned in part, I think, by the Manhattan Project's success, and were funded relentlessly until Congress finally pulled the plugs. Today the labs suffer from decades of neglect and misdirection, each pursuing research to survive rather than to meet national goals and priorities. Along with the nuclear weapons production complex and the staggering and dangerous arsenal it created, the nuclear labs remain our most costly legacy from the Manhattan Project. Regrettably, they need support and direction, but I think are unlikely to find either very soon. Now, the lab's problems were personified for me about 10 years ago when I visited Los Alamos as part of my work for the GAO. A program director we interviewed had just met with scientists from the former Soviet Union who were receiving support for non-weapons research work from federal programs. It must be strange, a Russian physicist told him, to finally meet your enemy. Oh no, the Los Alamos director reportedly told us. You're not our enemy. You're our competition. Our enemy is Livermore. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Phil. Having set the stage, now we turn to Bob Furman, who was actually there at the time and a major part of General Grove's staff. He tells us, he can tell us, what it was really like and what they thought they were doing at the time, or their mission, and the context of World War II.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here. It's a long time ago. I haven't thought about these things except when Cynthia calls. And as the number of World War II veterans die off, my story gets better and better. Last week I included Roosevelt, and this week I think I've got Churchill in mind. But it is true that there was a Manhattan District, and it hasn't completely faded away because everybody knows that it was incomparable. It did things that they thought couldn't be done. It put together cities half the size of Rhode Island. It managed the unmanageable. That means the scientists, if you can imagine, because that task alone ought to be studied. The scientists knew everything, had to do everything, had to bring about a successful project. The military had the money, had the manpower, had the time, and the two had to be mixed together. They didn't mix always very well. I won't be too long in telling you much about this project because you've read so much yourself. But I was brought on the project in about September, October of '43 by General Groves, who needed somebody to help him calm down the scientists who were scared that the Germans already had the atomic bomb and were about to use it that night or at least by weekend. I'm not kidding you. The Manhattan Project was fueled by fear, and right to the very end. And it was almost impossible without putting on a big effort to calm the scientists down and put them back to work, because they weren't working, they were worrying. So the plan was to bring somebody in and have them work with the scientists and set up a committee to work with them, bring reports from Europe, publications by German scientists, try to bring in more intelligence reports which would tell the scientists that their worries are not real, and travel among them and get their ideas. Exactly what I did. I was given immediately a letter signed by General Strong, who was the G2 of the Army. Big shot, in other words. There's only 4 Gs, and then Marshall above him. And my letter simply, this was an introduction letter which said that I was on a secret mission. Don't ask me any questions, but if you can help him, please do. So I carried that letter with me to the various Army agencies, to the big corporations which had intelligence units. I carried it overseas. I carried it and presented it wherever I thought I could get information. Because you got to remember that we had no intelligence organization here at the beginning of World War II. The British had one. Our intelligence units in the Army, Navy were minor, and they were everybody in those organizations were completely absorbed in raising the Army, getting the Army outfitted, building munition plants. Intelligence wasn't their main priority. Therefore, possibly they were getting reports and ignoring them, reports about activities overseas. We developed a plan to put a scientific mission behind the armies once they moved forward in Europe, and that was called the Alsace Mission. And it was a multi-talented mission representing all the scientific people. And buried in that mission, we put 3 atomic scientists. And as the armies moved forward, this was a valuable contribution because they were receiving deadly reports from the enemy saying a weapon of disastrous proportions was about to be dropped upon them. Therefore, retreat, whatever it is. And these reports were passed back to the Alsace Mission, and eventually one of these nuclear scientists would pick it up and be able to reply back to the Army commanders in a proper way to relieve the fear. This Alsace Mission was very effective as the armies moved forward in visiting with German scientists as they were captured or as the armies moved down past their universities or towns. And finally in Strasbourg, we were able to write a report that very likely, without any definite proof, but very likely the Germans had no project, that they were concentrating on something else, maybe missiles. Anyway, the intelligence did work to calm down the scientists. We eventually built a bomb in spite of the tremendous secrecy requirements, which were largely overridden to make the bomb work. The bomb was dropped on Tinian, taken to Tinian. I actually escorted part of it, and dropped on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki, and 6 days later the war was declared over. I want to emphasize that the biggest hero of this war may not be anybody that you would suspect, but in my mind it was the Japanese emperor who had the guts to stand up to the radio and tell the people that the war was over, to surrender, in spite of the army, which would have killed him if they could have, if they could have gotten to him before he got to the microphone. The Japanese people were completely subservient, and we were able to start a peace movement. We sent missions. General Groves sent 3 missions to the two to the various cities to check on medical and bomb damage, and the third one, which I commanded, went to all the universities and big corporations in Korea and Japan to see if they had any activity of any kind. That the war is now over, and we have created a nuclear age. The nuclear age is here. It's been here for a while. We are all participants in the effort to control the nuclear age to the benefits that it can give us, and not to let the bomb ever be used again. With those remarks, maybe I can take a little rest here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jim.
Thank you, Cindy. Thanks to all of you. Thanks, Mircea. Let me give Mircea as chair an unusual opportunity. He's my student, and so in the spirit of the long-windedness warning that Bill gave, you have a chance to shut up your advisor instead of the other way around. And if you see this book, you know long-windedness can be a problem, since it started as an article for my school newspaper, which turned into a 250-page thesis, which turned into a 700-page dissertation, which turned into a 1,000-page book, by the end of which I was an involuntary atomic historian and part of the Cold War legacy of the Manhattan Project, quite inadvertently, because I began my interest in the subject in 1981, Ronald Reagan's first year as president, when the nuclear issues just sort of reemerged onto the stage, and discovered, lo and behold, more or less doing procrastinating reading from my assigned reading in college, that at the heart of the decisions to build and use the atomic bomb was someone who was essentially moonlighting from his day job as president of Harvard University, James Bryant Conant, and discovering that someone at the top of the ivory tower had been crucial in decisions relating to weapons of mass destruction struck me as such a fascinating paradox that I began to investigate his story. And what it led me to was essentially the first major point that I want to make in my comments in terms of the relevance of the Manhattan Project, which is that even before Hiroshima, many of those engaged, or at least a good number of those engaged in the Manhattan Project, especially among some of the scientists and the handful of science administrators like James Bryant Conant and Vannevar Bush, a distant relative of some more recent Bushes, gave some extremely sustained and probing thought to the problem of atomic weapons in a way that the subsequent decades of the Cold War obscured, because once the Cold War got started in more or less in 1947, after the failure of the Burr Plan for International Control, it more or less set the nuclear arms race onto a path in which nuclear stability, mutual nuclear deterrence, became the be-all and end-all of what was not called anymore nuclear disarmament or nuclear arm or international control, but arms control, limitation, stability. It being recognized that the existence of two competing superpowers and then two competing superpower blocks really precluded simply eliminating nuclear weapons and avoiding a nuclear arms race. It more or less became a matter of avoiding World War III. The end of the Cold War seemed to open up prospects that had not existed since 1945, 1946, to make the United Nations what it was supposed to be in terms of a United Nations that would be able to use military force, and potentially one that would be the sole repository of nuclear technology and nuclear weapons, able to prevent potential secret rogue states from nuclear proliferation. And yet, because that was generations in the past, and I remember learning the definition of short-term, medium-term, and long-term policy in Washington. Short-term was for the evening news. Medium-term was for the next day's Times. Long-term was for Time and Newsweek. Now, of course, that was even before the Internet. So the idea that someone would remember back 45 years into the thinking of World War II, the Manhattan Project, that was pretty unlikely. But what was so striking in the 1980s and at the end of the Cold War is how relevant some of the ideas that atomic scientists near the end of the Manhattan Project and during the flowering of the atomic scientist movement and the effort to promote the idea of international control, especially in 1945 and 46, seemed to the problems of the 1980s and the 1990s, if only they were thought about in the same way. And let me just give one key example. In this room, probably most of you recall the Atchison Lillyenthal Plan, which was the first major plan for international control of atomic energy and atomic weapons devised by the veterans of the Manhattan Project, including J. Robert Oppenheimer and other scientists, but also including the bigwigs, Groves, Bush, Conant, John McCloy from the War Department, who had been a key aide to Henry Stimson. And they came up in early 1946 with something that today sounds unbelievably radical, which is that an international agency would not simply inspect plants, would not do what the IAEA does today, and this is a very much watered-down, faded echo from this initial plan, not engage in what J. Robert Oppenheimer called the dreary, sterile, and repressive job of atomic policing, but would itself be an international league of physicists, chemists, other atomic scientists, engineers, who would operate the entire nuclear power development process, from mining uranium to research to building and operating nuclear power plants, thus making it virtually impossible to secretly defect, to secretly build national programs. And the idea would be that it would be filled with red lights because the scientists would be sort of an international cadre who would know each other, they would teach each other, they would work together, and you just couldn't have a massive secret program. That proposal, of course, was developed just as the Cold War was getting underway in early 1946, around the time of Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech, the crisis over Soviet troops in northern Iran, the first scandal over Soviet atomic spying broke in Canada in early 1946, and American domestic politics was shifting sharply to the right. And Harry Truman thought this was way too radical. It would not sell on Capitol Hill. And instead he appointed Bernard Baruch as the negotiator. He thought this plan was not only too radical, but that it was socialist. It would not enshrine the principles of free enterprise. And he instead came up with the Baruch Plan, which focused on national programs, focused on punishment of violators, focused on depriving the Soviet Union especially, which was then in the minority, of a veto power over operations. And international control would die for the most part by the end of 1946, because Baruch's plan was, first you had to have a program of inspections underway to make sure that the Soviet Union was thoroughly monitored in terms of its own uranium processing, mining, etc. And then the U.S. would gradually hand over its atomic assets. That, of course, was countered by the Gromyko Plan. The same Andrei Gromyko, all of you remember in his later incarnation as Grim Grom, the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs for decades, who said the first objective is for all nations possessing atomic bombs to destroy them. And then we can worry about controls. And, of course, that sequence was not acceptable to the United States. So by the end of 1946, international control was more or less a dead letter, although there's an interesting aftermath. And the Cold War had gotten underway, and it simply became a matter of who was going to stay ahead in the race, and then trying to restrain it after the leap not only to both sides having fission weapons by 1949, but both sides having fusion, thermonuclear H-bombs by the mid-1950s. But what was so fascinating in the 1980s, and really not only the Cold War, but the post-Cold War legacy, is that when Ronald Reagan, for example, proposed his Star Wars initiative in the mid-1980s, and claimed to Mikhail Gorbachev at Reykjavik, for example, that we would love to give this system to you. And Gorbachev scoffed, saying, you won't even give us modern dairy milking equipment. Why should we expect you to give us, your... And they could not get over this problem of transition. The solution, of course, would have been at Atchison, Lillyenthal. If you had both sides participating, with both sides scientists simultaneously developing a program, then neither side would fear that the other side had achieved a breakthrough in secrecy. And of course, this was not only the idea of Atchison Lillyenthal, but if you go back into the Manhattan Project's history, as I did at nauseating length in my book, you find that some of these characters, like Oppenheimer and Conant, and most dramatically Niels Bohr, who led a lonely crusade to try to convince Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt of this in 1944, that the only chance of avoiding a post-war nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union leading, it was thought, inevitably to a World War III in 10, 15, 20 years, it was just a matter of how long, would be to have both sides scientists participating simultaneously, so neither side would fear falling behind. Because otherwise, what they were groping towards was what the political scientists would call the prisoner's dilemma, that because both sides feared falling behind, both sides would race to stay ahead and validate the other's fears, and the race would be endless. And if one looks at the problem of nuclear proliferation today and in recent years, you have this great irony that with the end of the Cold War, the great nuclear war of World War III that everyone feared for decades left, but the danger of small nuclear wars, small N, small W, and of course nuclear terrorism became much greater. And also, of course, there was the problem of control of nuclear technology that became far more difficult to handle and far less of a political priority than many would argue than it had been during the Cold War. And also, of course, you had the breakdown of a bipolar international system. You had the danger of regional nuclear arms races in which the pressures for nuclear development would just be, to coin a phrase, a chain reaction. The Chinese got the bomb, the Indians needed one, the Indians got one, the Pakistanis needed one, if the Pakistanis got one, the Iranians needed, and you can have these situations in various parts of the globe. If the North Koreans became serious nuclear powers, can one imagine Japan not wanting to become one? And again, we're living in this post-Cold War world, but these are very much the concerns of the Manhattan Project scientists, at least some among them. And one of the questions I would love to ask Bob Furman is to what extent he heard General Groves and James Conant and Vannevar Bush worry about these kind of post-war issues and not merely the race to finish it before World War II would end. And what's fascinating, and I've completely lost track of how much more time I've got. 5 minutes?
You've got
or so?
another 5 minutes, yeah.
Is how some of those in the Manhattan Project, Szilard at the working level, Conant at the political level, tried to somehow juggle the long-term fear that this was inexorably leading to the destruction of civilization and the short-term imperative of having to finish this bomb before the Germans did, possibly. And watching these mental gyrations, even before Hiroshima, absolutely fascinating. And one of the things that Lanawy found, Szilard found out, and I found out that Conant came to, is even though they were very much not completely good friends during the project. In fact, Groves actually despised Szilard and wanted to lock him up. But they came to a very similar conclusion, which was that you almost needed to use the bomb, not so much to win World War II, but that you would be in an even worse situation if World War II ended without the bomb being used, but the danger of World War III being far greater and the threat not being appreciated or comprehended. And so Conant, who was in a position to influence the decision-making, rationalized to himself that the only way to achieve the compromises of sovereignty that would be necessary to really avoid World War III and have effective international control is you had to so shock the world and horrify the world by using the atomic bomb on civilians. And only then would the world be shocked into making those, very radical political changes that he and in another context Niels Bohr thought necessary. Bohr used the phrase "another experimental arrangement" to express what he thought sovereignty needed to be. And so I think those looking at the present and the future, and especially how to strengthen safeguards on problems of nuclear technology, the spread of nuclear technology, could really learn. Let me just, the problem was framed at the time, I'll just quote from something James Bryant Conant said in 1945, that the manufacture of atomic bombs cannot be divorced from the use of uranium as a source of atomic energy for industrial purposes. Any nation which had atomic energy power plants would have the wherewithal to make bombs. The larger the power plants, the larger number of potential bombs. I quote that just to say that the essential problem, the essential existential problem, was understood then, but it was taken much more seriously in many ways because it was so new. And, you know, one thing I try to get across to my students, I see most of you are at least old enough to remember the Soviet Union as something more than an object in history books. But, you know, to get across to my students, you know, how important all this was, we are, you know, living incarnations of the least likely scenario that the Manhattan Project scientists foresaw. The most famous first book, the collection of essays by atomic energy, Manhattan Project scientists, was One World or None. That either there would be an agreement on effective international control of atomic energy, or World War III, destroying civilization, was essentially inevitable. The idea that you would have had a full-scale thermonuclear arms race and not have World War III, well, would have gotten about as many votes as Ron Paul got in the Wisconsin primary a couple of nights ago. I mean, it was extremely unlikely, and yet this is sort of taken for granted in retrospect. Only now are we starting to see the process that was feared happening much more quickly, but that the Cold War sort of put in an artificial deep freeze for several decades. Let me conclude by just raising one other potential legacy. Bill brought up, you know, the three M's, the Manhattan Project, the Marshall Plan, and the Moon Project as, you know, these big scientific endeavors that are sometimes cited as examples for what to do next. You know, one thing that's been striking, obviously, recently is not only war on terror, which has been mentioned, but the problem of global warming. And it's reminiscent of the Manhattan Project because you have to bring different disciplines together. There are engineering, scientific, economic, political. It would be fascinating, you know, to try to examine whether there are things to be learned from the way the Manhattan Project was put together to deal with such a daunting global problem like global warming. And I one thing that's been on my mind because I've just finished reading them is there's a trilogy of novels by someone named Kim Stanley Robinson on the politics of global warming in Washington in essentially the present. And what's fascinating is that it takes an administration very much like the current administration as the backdrop, and what it's about is a bunch of scientists who become frustrated with politicians for the lack of comprehension and action, and decide that, without mentioning the Manhattan Project scientists as their model, that scientists can't simply be passively waiting for politicians to ask them to do things or to compete for their funds. Scientists need to organize themselves as a political force, like the Manhattan Project scientists did in 1945 and 46 to push for international control. And in the end, what happens is that the National Science Foundation, which is sort of a backwater branch of the federal government, and itself a direct legacy of the Manhattan Project, formed by Vannevar Bush in a report called The Endless Frontier in 1945 to say that the Manhattan Project showed that basic scientific research, even though you can't necessarily see what it's going to lead to, is essential for national security. The National Science Foundation decides we need to become a big behemoth on the Washington scene, and we scientists need to organize ourselves politically, or else it's going to be too late. So I'll just leave for discussion the idea of whether that's a possibility for the next Manhattan Project. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Very much appreciated. And thank you all for the fascinating comments. I think we're gonna what we're gonna do now is gonna open it up for discussion among the panelists for about 20 minutes or so, or maybe less, and then we're gonna open it up to your questions. So I'm gonna turn it over to you, Cynthia, and to get the discussion started.
Okay. Well, I think maybe I'll just pick up with Jim, who said you have a question you want to pose to Bob. So why don't you restate it?
Sure. I'm curious, you know, one thing, once the Cold War got going in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, it became very fashionable to say, I knew the Russians were so bad, even though they were our allies. And one thing General Groves said is that even during the Manhattan Project, I treated the Russians, not the Germans, as our major security threat. Does that accord with your recollections? And also, one great dog that doesn't bark during the Manhattan Project is that the Soviets, we now know, to coin a phrase, were definitely spying on the Manhattan Project. We now have seen many of the records from the Russian archive. Was there ever any German effort to spy on the Manhattan Project detected? And do you agree that Groves really did treat the Russians as the main security threat during the project?
Well, lots of things were thrown around, and that was discussed. But when I say discussed, I would hear him talking about it. It really was a national fear rather than something just thrown around. We felt that the Germans would lose the war, but we would have the Russians to contend with. I know in my own case, when I was in Europe, I was cautioned never to go near the lines, the Russian lines, because they were looking for people like me. The focus, don't forget, the focus was on winning the war, and anything else you want to talk about was mere secondary comment. So Groves was constantly concerned with getting the bomb ready and using it, if necessary, on whoever was left. And I don't think he worried too much about the Russians.
Thanks.
You wanted do you have anything to say about the Germans being a spy, actually having espionage?
The Germans probably had spies, but there was a funny story told by Lansdale. Colonel Lansdale was our security chief. He had to pick up 3 or 4 Germans in New York who had come across the Canadian border looking for the Manhattan Project in Manhattan. But beyond that, I can't think of any real threat.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question on that? Do you think that part of that was because, the emigres working on the Manhattan Project had basically run away from the Germans, but at the same time they were, of a leftist ideological outlook and were more likely to be sympathetic to the Soviet Union, not knowing exactly what the internal situation in the Soviet Union was to begin with, than to be sympathetic to the Germans that were basically trying to escape. Do you think that was part of the reason, or was it just that the Germans weren't interested in?
It's true that our scientific project, was manned by refugees from Germany and other parts of Europe, Hungarians. But anyway, there was no sympathy for the Germans and none for the Russians either among these people. We all admitted at that particular time there was some sympathy for communism, which we don't have today, but I don't think that was a major problem. All the scientists that I talked to were anxious that I find a way to ensure that the bomb wasn't going to be dropped on them. And I don't think they were glad to be in America and not still in Germany.
In 1942 and 1943 in Chicago, Leo Szilard and some of the refugees were quite concerned that the Germans may not develop an explosive bomb, but would certainly develop a dirty bomb and drop radioactive debris on American cities. And they went so far as, by 43, to draw up their own scheme for how to make radiological weapons. That is, dispersal weapons, what we call dirty bombs today. And they were concerned. Remember that we had U-boats on our shores, and they were quite concerned that something messy and radioactive could still be used as a weapon, even though they may not explode an actual fission bomb. It strikes me as incredibly ironic that in June of 42, there was a great crossover. In 1939, as soon as fission was announced, the Germans put their program right into the Army, and they were way ahead of us for a couple of years. But But in June of 42, the Germans thought they were winning the war, and there was a meeting that Tom Powers writes about in Heisenberg's War, where the scientists essentially went to Speer, who was overseeing production, and they said, well, we can't have this thing anywhere near done by the time we win. So Speer said, we don't need those resources, and they scaled back their program. The same month, we scaled up our program and gave it to the Army. So there was this crossover, and then we never knew that they had stopped their program. And as far as they were concerned, they probably didn't want to spy on us because they thought a weapon like this would be useless before the war was over.
In that respect, it's anyone who's interested in the intelligence debate over Iraqi nuclear weapons would find highly amusing reading some of the U.S. documents in 42, 43, 44 about the German program. Because, indeed, not only the same month, the same week, in late June 1942, the Germans essentially decided not to go for the bomb, and FDR put one of his famous check marks, and if you got the money for Vannevar Bush, essentially approving a crash program. Because the essential decision in principle to build the bomb had been made in the fall of 41, and Conant and Bush were at the Office of Scientific Research and Development, were given the job of, okay, which method should we use? And they spent months agonizing over choosing which method to use, and they essentially came back saying, well, we're not sure which one might work first. The one that might be most reliable is not the most efficient. If we put all our eggs in one basket and it fails, we'll have nothing. And so the decision was made, we have to go for all the methods at the same time, which was the force multiplier that made the Manhattan Project so enormous. And again, that was exactly the same time that the Germans decided not to go forward at all. But if you read the memos, December 42 to December 43, the estimates, the Germans are probably 12 to 18 months ahead. And it's a fascinating parallel with recent history. Then when it was only the Alsace Mission in late 44 that ascertained fairly firmly that the Germans had given up their program a couple of years earlier, but the U.S. didn't say, okay, we don't need to worry anymore, we could stop ours. They raced ahead. The irony was, then after the war, when there was intelligence debates about, well, what about the Soviets? Can they build a bomb? And you had this boomerang effect. Well, we had overestimated how well the Germans are doing. Let's not fall for that trap again. So then they underestimated how far the Soviets had gotten. And you see these kinds of one great CIA document was released at a conference about 10 years ago from mid-September 1949, a highly classified, above top secret CIA document of a Joint Atomic Intelligence Committee estimating that it will be at least 2 years before the Soviets get the bomb. And of course, a week before, the fallout from the first Soviet bomb had already been collected and analyzed, but was considered too dangerous and in a separate compartment to tell the CIA committee responsible for atomic intelligence about it. So they were still estimating that the Soviets wouldn't get the bomb for another couple of years when they had gotten it 3 weeks earlier. So these intelligence follies that you've witnessed recently are hardly new. In fact, I commend Jeff Richardson has done a nice book about atomic intelligence on this course. So this is yet another legacy. And something in line with what Bill was saying is Cold War secrecy, the born secret nature of so much of the national security state, which was formally enshrined in the National Security Act of 1947, really comes out of the Manhattan Project. And General Groves sends directives at August 1945 saying it's secret unless cleared otherwise, not the other way around. That everything is secret unless you have an explicit directive, and that's why the Smythe Report, that's how the Smythe Report was used. This was the official U.S. government report on the Manhattan Project, saying if it's in there, you can talk about it. If it's not, it's not. And everything else that comes out of this entire complex that will emerge about atomic weapons and atomic energy is presumed secret. And another interesting analogy is all of the controversy about Guantanamo and rendition and all these things. A lot of similarities for a massive government program that, because of politics, national security, was essentially completely separated from normal oversight, normal congressional interest, run by people who felt that they had an overarching national security imperative, and really felt that If they wanted to do it, they determined the rules. And it's, essentially, I think, with arguably better cause, but it's a reasonable controversy, sometimes crossing the line.
I think you could say that the extraterrestrial business that thrives in Roswell, New Mexico, is a result of this Manhattan Project secrecy, because all that really landed there was a weather balloon released from Los Alamos, which they refused to identify because they didn't want people knowing that we were trying to take atmospheric samples, and so they denied it until it became something that conspiracy theorists have made quite a bit of money on.
Yeah.
I guess we're going to open it up to all of you. Please, again, wait for the microphone to get to you, and please identify yourself before speaking. So, just start right there.
I have a
Just
comment.
1 second. Just 1 second, please.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
I have a comment. I'm Frank Settle from Washington Lee University, and I have a comment and a question for Bob Furman. I've read a lot about the Manhattan Project scientists being, the driving force was to beat the Germans. And when the war was over, nobody really quit. Maybe Roblot quit, but the majority of the scientists continued to work. And I kind of understand why, but I'd like to get your insight on that. And my comment is this, for you and for the audience. The Alsace Mission is alive and well in one form. We have something called the Alsace Digital Library for Nuclear Issues, which is it's an annotated bibliography of about 2,500 references now on a broad range of topics. So I got to put the plug in for that. But coming back to the question, what was the mindset of people when the Germans surrendered? Why didn't they sort of peel back on their effort?
Well, it's pretty clear to me that we were in it to win the war, and that included Japan. And as soon as the war was over in Europe, our efforts were directed towards winning the war in Japan. I had a list of only 8 nuclear scientists in Japan, and I was getting ready to go try to find them. So it was an overall objective, not just a war to win in Germany.
I would just add to that again at the top political level, and this is something that has gone over ad nauseum in multiple books, that of course in the spring of '45, Harry Truman very anxiously desired to know if the atomic bomb was for real before he met Stalin. And he put off his summit meeting until mid-July, in part in the hope that the test would be conducted in time to know whether he could really rely on this in terms of potential bargaining with Stalin. And that just added pressure that was already there. Also, of course, there's the more mundane business of justifying the entire project. Conant and Groves used to joke that if the war ended before the bomb was actually finished and used, they should buy houses on Capitol Hill because they'll spend the rest of their lives testifying before Congress. So there are a multitude of reasons to justify not walking away, and you're right, only Rotblat did.
But do you think it would have made? I think you brought it up at some point that there was that crossover when the Germans were scaling back the project and the U.S. was just putting more money in. And I wonder, for the entire panel, do you think it would have made a difference in 1942? Obviously, in 44, it wasn't going to make a difference anymore. But in 42, do you think it would have made a difference if the U.S. had known that the Germans were scaling back? The Germans were basically giving up on seeking an atomic bomb. Would that have, I don't want to say killed the Manhattan Project, but at least put it on the back burner?
No. It wouldn't have made any difference. We were losing men by the thousands in the Pacific, and we built the bomb to win the war. That's the answer to that. The war was not over, and I don't know, does anyone else have an opinion on that?
Sure, but Bill, you want to?
Yeah, I think some of the scientists, especially those who had fled Hitler, really thought they were racing the Nazis, and that in May, after Germany surrendered, they were quite upset about, at that point, looking forward about a nuclear arms race with Russia. So they were worried about Russia and worried about what using these weapons would do to the post-war world. And Harold Urey, who had developed the method of enriching uranium, and Leo Szilard, who had designed the first reactor and worked at the Met Lab, both used an Einstein letter to try to get to President Truman, and they were sent to talk to Jimmy Burns, who was Truman's advisor on the Manhattan Project. And they warned him about international control, and his main concerns to them, as expressed in Szilard's recollections and two things that Burns wrote, was that his main concerns were Congress and Russia, and that if they didn't use this weapon before the end of the war, and it was found out that there would be investigations galore because Congress didn't know it had spent $20 billion. And second, he knew he was about to be Secretary of State. He was at Yalta, and he wanted to make the Russians more manageable, as he told Szilard. And so there were these other political motives that the scientists were really not aware of, and they in their visionary way could look forward to a more utopian world. But these other pressures about Congress and the Russians were certainly driving the war even beyond the surrender of the Germans.
I want to get back out to the audience, but it's a fascinating counterfactual. If one imagines June 1942, the U.S. has an intelligence source at that meeting where the Nazis give it up, certainly there would have been some slackening of worry and maybe of steam behind the project. But one of the fascinating things that, again, emerges from the document is that from the moment the political level in the United States is pushed, in part because of the British were the ones who believed in it first in 40-41, before the American leadership became convinced. The moment they become convinced that this thing can exist, they immediately realize this isn't just another weapon that's relevant for winning or losing the war, because they quickly come to the conclusion that we're going to win unless the Germans get this thing first. But immediately you start seeing phrases like after-war controls and policing the post-war world. And this is simultaneously with, again, everyone at a leadership level had lived through World War I and the disillusionment afterwards. And there was a determination that if we're going to get into this war again, especially after Pearl Harbor, because in your counterfactual, Pearl Harbor has happened, we're not going to get snookered by the British again. We're not going to get in and get out and let the British, take the spoils. We're going to get in this war, and afterwards we're going to assume the political, diplomatic, and military leadership of the world. Therefore, if this weapon can exist, even if we just have to prove that it can't exist, we have to find out, because it would be unacceptable for anyone else to get it, whether or not it's decisive in this war. So I think the Manhattan Project would have gone forward, but it would have been a heck of a lot harder, again, in a world of perfect intelligence where you know that our enemies are not building it, to have the kind of overarching priority, where it's the highest priority of all war projects to get resources, which led to incredible battles. And that would have been tougher if you knew that you did not have an enemy that was threatening to use it. Anyway.
One mystery to me.
Can ID yourself?
Stephen Shore. You have the first atomic bomb dropped at the Trinity site. Now, arguably,
not exactly dropped, but yes,
or imploded or whatever the technical word is, and it's kept secret. I mean, you in theory, if you drop you explode an atomic bomb, people will raise questions and write about it.
It was a munitions dump that exploded. Yes,
that was the official story. But how on earth did they manage to keep the lid on the story?
Well, I strongly recommend to all of you, if you are not intrinsically, obsessively interested in this story, but would like to expose yourself to that possibility, that you see something that I did as an undergraduate, which first got me hooked, which is The Day After Trinity, which is a wonderful documentary made by John Ellis in 1979 about the Manhattan Project, and especially J. Robert Oppenheimer. And it includes things like interviews of, the woman talking about how her sister noticed it while they were driving only 100 miles away, and she happened to be blind. That's what was especially memorable. But one thing that was great fun for me was discovering how nervous they were. And this has given me an excuse to read one snippet from my book. Back in 1942, summer of 42, when they were just getting going, there was a sort of alarming research that was conducted by some of the physicists which pointed to the theoretical possibility that the first atomic explosion might ignite the nitrogen atoms in the atmosphere, causing a chain reaction that would lead to the destruction of the Earth. And they thought that was interesting and that they should look into that. And so there was a bit of a symposium organized at Berkeley, and actually Chuck to Lansdale, he was sent out there because they discovered that they were talking about the results in the lunchroom, and it was gossip in the cafeteria about it. And they discovered that the chances of this happening were rather small. The number I heard was 3 in 10 million. So they said, okay, that's good enough. We can go ahead. But the night of the Trinity test, it was supposed to take place, late in the evening, but it was windy, rainy. The test kept getting delayed. It didn't take place till 5:29 in the morning. And so there's a lot of black humor. And there's the famous joke about, Enrico Fermi taking bets about whether it would destroy, all of New Mexico or just, a 200-mile square area, and taking side bets that it would just destroy the entire planet and things like that. And this was sort of dismissed as black humor. Well, when I was working on my undergraduate thesis on James B. Conant, plug again, I knew that he had been at Trinity on the morning of July 16th. But even though he wrote an incredibly dense and turgid, I have to say this isn't, 701-page memoir about his life, or my several lives, he managed not to describe how he felt at the Trinity test, which really annoyed me greatly. And then when I was pawing through the archives in Washington, not in College Park yet, in Washington, I came across a withdrawal slip. And if you are researchers, you know that if a document is withheld because of extreme national security sensitivity, it is withdrawn. And there's just a slip with its date and title. And you have to apply through the Freedom of Information. J.B. Conant, notes on the Trinity test, 16 July, and I've got this ironclad thesis deadline to meet, but I know this document exists, so I called up the chain of command to plead, can you just look at this one document before my thesis is due? I don't care about technical information. I just want to know what he was feeling at the end. And they took pity on me. They declassified it. And the whole 8-page handwritten notes, only one thing was classified, and it was the high end of the betting pool for the yield of the explosion. But it had his whole description of his experience. He was 10,000 yards, I think, from ground zero, lying on the ground, looking at the opposite horizon. But he disobeyed orders. He didn't have the dark piece of glass in front of his eyes. His eyes were open. And I'll describe his description. He said, through the loudspeaker nearby, I heard Allison, Samuel K. Allison, counting the seconds, minus 45, minus 40, minus 30, minus 20, minus 10. The firing was done by some kind of timing device started at minus 45 seconds. These were long seconds. Then came a burst of white light that seemed to fill the sky and seemed to last for seconds. I had expected a relatively quick and bright flash. The enormity of the light and its length quite stunned me. My instantaneous reaction was that something had gone wrong and that the thermal-nuclear transformation of the atmosphere, once discussed as a possibility and jokingly referred to a few minutes earlier, had actually occurred. And so think about human history and how many people were awake, sober, and had an intellectual justification for what they were thinking, literally believed they were seeing the world come to an end in front of their eyes. So the very first split second of the atomic era, James Conant thought the world was literally coming to an end. And he ended his notes by writing, my first impression remains the most vivid, a cosmic phenomenon like an eclipse, the whole sky suddenly full of white light like the end of the world. Perhaps my impression was only premature on a time scale of years. A nice foreboding for the Cold War part of my undergraduate thesis. How do they keep it secret? They got lucky. No one reported it. A lot of people noticed it. And, they only had a couple of weeks to keep the lid on. It is still murky in the Russian archives whether Stalin found out about it before Potsdam, after Trinity, and before Potsdam a week later when Truman has the conversation with him. There are Russian sources that claim he did, but frankly, it's a little bit doubtful because Klaus Fuchs's reports didn't reach Moscow that quickly. and they might be exaggerating his knowledge. There's no question, though, that when Truman made the nonchalant comment about a weapon of unusual destructiveness, that he knew what he was talking about and sent back the word saying, "Tell Kurchatov to hurry up the boys."
I'm John Szilard, and I have a question about Heisenberg. I'm confused about why Heisenberg turned off the German program. I've heard scientific explanations, which I question because he was a Nobel Prize winner for a smart guy. Maybe there are political reasons. I have really two questions. One is, did Heisenberg himself ever give an explanation for his action? And if not, what do the historians think was, in fact, the reason? Because it was an incredibly important act on his part.
Do you want to give it a shot first?
Heisenberg's various statements have been very ambiguous, and I think he gave 3 or 4. I'm not an expert on this, but I'll tell you what I remember reading, and I'd refer you to Tom Power's book. He gave 3 or 4 different explanations as to why they didn't have a bomb. One was that they didn't think they'd need one before they won. Another was that he wanted to maintain the viability of German science, and therefore he scaled it back so that it, in effect, escaped the military control. For he was already thinking of the post-war situation. In the tapes when they that were recorded at Farm Hall when they were all locked up and heard about the Hiroshima bomb on BBC radio, he and the others were clearly confused about what had actually occurred. They thought at that time, if they can be believed, that it would have taken tons and not kilograms of uranium to explode. And it was only, I think, about a week later that Heisenberg, again taped when he was incarcerated, tried to explain to his colleagues how we could have actually isolated enough uranium-235 to have a uranium explosion. After the war, in one of his memoirs, and I can't remember which, I think he wrote 2, he said that he's glad that the Germans didn't drop the bomb first, and that they essentially didn't want Hitler to have it. So depending on what month or year you read Heisenberg, he seemed to have a different tack on this whole approach.
Let me add a few things. First of all, Bill has already mentioned Tom Power's book, Heisenberg's War, twice, so I will refer you not to that, because actually scholars who know the German sources in German, which Tom didn't, have rather strongly criticized it as too overly sympathetic to Heisenberg. And in particular, there's a scholar named Mark Walker and another one named Paul Rose, who have written excellent books. One's called The Myth of the German Atomic Bomb, and there's one that's a study of German culture that deals with it. And they strongly argue that Heisenberg's War, Power's book, is essentially too gullible, although it has been by far the most influential, not because of history, but I don't know if any of you have seen the play Copenhagen, which largely adopts Power's interpretation. I would strongly urge you to check out these other books, and also, in response to the controversy over the play Copenhagen, the Niels Bohr Institute released correspondence, some of it never sent, by Bohr, in which he took strong issue with Heisenberg's claims about what was actually said between them in the fall of 1941. And by the way, the key text that really enshrined what critics say was Heisenberg's attempt to sort of post hoc glorify the role of the German scientists in extolling their moral desire to withhold the bomb from Hitler. Robert Jungk wrote a very influential book, that's Jungk, called Brighter Than a Thousand Suns, which appeared in the late 50s in German and then was translated. And that really sort of bought Heisenberg's mid-50s version of events, which was they didn't want to give Hitler the bomb. However, critics, and I think they're in the preponderance, say that that's not really supported by the evidence, that it's much more likely that, because that implied that the Germans could have built, the scientists could have built it for Hitler, but for moral reasons withheld it. They point to evidence that they did not fully understand the process, that in fact Heisenberg rationalized staying for the good of Germany, even though he wasn't an active Nazi, that he rationalized that he still wanted Germany to win the war because it was better than those barbaric Russians winning it, that he also had self-interested motives for his own career, and that most importantly, again, as Bill has alluded, in 1942 when the German High Command and Speer wanted the scientists to report on whether the bomb could be built, they had an over-optimistic time frame. They thought they would win the war within a year or two at the most, and essentially said, what can you give us that will be ready by the time that the war is done? They didn't imagine it would last that long. And that sort of exempted the German scientists from having to say, whether or not it was possible, because even under the most optimistic time frame, they couldn't finish it in 9 months or a year, which is what they were being asked. But I think there are a lot of skeptics, among them those involved in the Alsace project, including Groves in his memoirs and Samuel Goldsmith, who strongly believe that the German physicists who stayed behind, had they been ordered to, certainly would not have withheld the bomb for moral reasons. But that being said, in their defense, they certainly didn't show the enthusiasm for trying to build it the way that the anti-Hitler scientists in the United States did.
I kind of historians to explain everything, but in this case they have not really explained it.
Just one second.
It's an event of enormous importance. Maybe 100 years from now they'll figure it out.
I would read Mark Walker's stuff. I think he's probably the best on this.
I was intrigued by James Hirschberg's comment in your remarks that we're, this group sitting here, we're living testimony to this improbable scenario that you would survive with a nation-state still having the control of the bomb, and yet we haven't had World War III. That led me to Richard Rhodes in the introduction here has this...
That's his new book, right?
No, not yet. Just a second. No, just his comment here. I'm going to talk about his new book.
Yeah.
Your book, the one we're talking about here, Cindy's book, says that, is the atomic bomb actually a blessing rather than a curse because we haven't had World War or any war, since then, any major world war since then, and yet in Arsenal's Folly, he points to at least 3 occasions where we were on the brink of World War III, and it was only dumb luck that stopped it from happening, and the missile crisis being one, but then 2 occasions in 1980. So I wonder about this. It's not just Rhodes who has this point of view. Spencer Weird also says the bomb's existence has prevented a World War III. Just wonder about this scenario.
Well, I think what applies is that cliche that gets mentioned, probably almost every event here. When Henry Kissinger asked Zhou Enlai what he thought of the French Revolution, and Zhou Enlai, of course, says that it's too soon to tell. If that was true about the French Revolution, it's certainly way true about the Manhattan Project. It's way soon to tell whether what we have lived through so far was simply the prelude to what most of the Manhattan Project feared would be inevitable, that without an effective regime to prevent a nuclear arms race, it was simply a matter of time. Although, keep in mind, they had all lived through World War I and World War II, and that was seen as just the way the world worked. It would just be, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and then, as Stalin would say, we'll have another go with them. How close we came during the Cold War is obviously something that the Cold War International History Project and a lot of others look at very closely, not only the missile crisis, but I think what you're alluding to in the 1980s is there's still a very murky episode in late 1983, and most of you were around to remember the context of the shooting down of the Korean airliner, the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut, the invasion of Grenada, the breakdown of arms control talks in Europe, and various other events. According to a KGB agent who defected, he was the station chief in London, the top of the Soviet hierarchy believed that Ronald Reagan was seriously contemplating a nuclear first strike on the Soviet Union, and came very close to believing that this was imminent when there was a practice of nuclear release procedures in what was known as Operation Able Archer, conducted by NATO in early November 1983. And Robert Gates, who was then Bill Casey's DCI, has said that they thought that the Soviets were taking this so seriously that we had to pass some word to scale this back. Now, the Soviet agent who defected claims that this was as serious as the Cuban Missile Crisis, except it was all in secret. If that's true, it's theoretically very important because there was a whole rafter of books in the 1980s that some of you might remember: McGeorge Bundy, Danger and Survival; John Muller, The Obsolescence of Major War; and a very famous article by John Lewis Gaddis, The Long Peace, all of which implied that the history of the nuclear world since World War II was of a period of instability, recurrent crisis, then the crisis of 1962, and then increasing stability. The two nuclear rivals became more judicious, statesmanlike. Nuclear deterrence became more stable, predictable, and therefore you could rely on it into the indefinite future. If that 1983 crisis was as serious as this defector claim, that completely destroys all the theories of nuclear learning, because it implies that nuclear war almost happened out of complete misjudgment. I mean, Ronald Reagan said a lot of extreme things, but nuclear war would probably not have boosted his re-election campaign in 1984. And therefore, it implies that nuclear learning cannot be counted on for the indefinite future. On the other hand, we still don't have things like Politburo minutes to confirm how seriously this was taken at the top level, even though we do have things like cables to KGB stations telling them to watch to see if the lights were on all night at the Pentagon and blood was being hoarded to get ready for nuclear war and things like that, which again shows how poorly understood the prospect of nuclear was, even 4 decades after the Manhattan Project.
I was also thinking under Carter, where there was actually NORAD had seen missiles.
Oh yeah, within 15 minutes and things like that.
15 minutes to make a decision whether to destroy the world or not, and it took 3 phone calls finally.
Well, and in that fall of '83, something that came out only after the Cold War. Apparently, a few weeks after the shooting down of the Korean airliner, apparently there was, I believe, a Norwegian weather test missile that was sent up, and somehow anyone who's been in the Soviet Union or Russia will be shocked to hear that there was a bureaucratic mix-up, and the office that received the warning that this test was going to take place somehow forgot to pass it to the Air Defense Service, and there was apparently a nuclear-tipped anti-missile station that got a reading of an incoming nuclear missile. And fortunately, one of the talk about unsung heroes of the Cold War, there was a local commander who didn't believe it, decided not to fire the missile, and was reprimanded afterwards. But we owe a debt of gratitude.
My name is Vladimir, and I'm interning at the Cold War Project. Dr. Hirschberg, you said that one of the explanations for the use of the A-bomb was to shock the world into making radical political changes. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure whether that reflects your personal opinion or not, but do you really think that that was an effective gesture to bring about long-term stability, or was it more like an attempt to justify the project itself? Thank you.
Oh, well, I think more the latter, but they're not necessarily incompatible. I think those who adopted that view, I mean, there were people like Groves and Truman who simply had no qualms. I mean, this was simply another weapon of war against those who had attacked at Pearl Harbor, who had committed atrocities, who simply felt that there was no different moral issue necessarily than strategic bombing or other problems. There were those like Burns who thought, well, this would be doubly beneficial because it'll intimidate the Russians, make them more manageable. But there were a few who thought, well, I don't really believe that this is going to be good for our relations with Russia, and this this might not be militarily necessary. So to some extent, it was a rationalization of something that they knew was politically going to happen anyway. And therefore, they, I think for their own conscience to some extent, came to believe that, well, we need to do this. Maybe a benefit will be it will shock the world into understanding the need for international control. Now, you could certainly criticize this, and they were criticized that to some extent, and I write about it actually in the book, that this is playing God, this is sort of using 200,000 Japanese to make a political point, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm simply reporting that this is what a couple of those involved, more among the scientists, who are more fearful of the future than the political level, used to rationalize it. And in retrospect, one can argue that it certainly helps ingrain a nuclear taboo. During the Korean War, there were officials who raised the possibility of using nuclear weapons in Korea, and there were others who said, using this on Asians twice in 10 years is not really going to build a lot of friendship for America, in the emerging decolonizing world. So this, one can argue that it's a counterfactual that never got tested. If everything else is the same, but the Japanese surrendered before Hiroshima, and yet the nuclear weapons are still being developed, would it have been more likely that the Cold War would have become very hot?
What strikes me in looking at the history of the Manhattan Project is just how unconnected it was to what we take for granted as the usual political and international system. It really had a life of its own, and Stan Norris has chapters on Groves having his own treasury, having his own State Department, having his own intelligence, and in fact, we didn't know until 2 or so weeks before we used it that it would even work. And so it was never integrated into the kind of decision-making structure that we, as historians, try to examine. And so you don't find a cabinet meeting at which this was discussed. It was arranged in a very haphazard way. And it really, the Manhattan Project reminds me of the corporate event that it was. It was like DuPont or GM or somebody bringing out a new product. And they're not going to let anybody know about it till they know that it works and until they can put it out on sale. And the fact that DuPont ran it and that the Army, with its own regime of secrecy, ran it, I think makes it a very difficult experience to analyze in traditional historical terms.
And of course, it didn't help historians that, Franklin Roosevelt was not Dwight Eisenhower when it came to organizing the presidency. With Eisenhower, you have these nice National Security Council meetings with detailed minutes, and you have flow charts. FDR liked to handle everything personally, would tell people what they wanted to hear, and he was confiding things about the bomb to the British and not telling his own atomic advisors. So it was a very disorganized process in terms of charting the evolution of thinking. And then you essentially had a Veep, Harry Truman, who barely knew anything about the bomb. In fact, was shunted aside as a senator by Henry Stimson when he took an interest into what was going on at Oak Ridge on the Appropriations Committee. So it was essentially dumped in his lap when he became president just a few months before the bomb was ready. And that certainly didn't help for any kind of coherent process in terms of examining either its use or its implications.
Let me take a couple of questions, and we're going to then continue the discussion over a glass of wine and some cheese. So, go on.
Yes, I'm Kim Grant with the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum. Mm-hmm. And I have a question. Maybe it's a little premature, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The other day I saw a book entitled The New Cold War, Putin's Russia and the New Threat to America. And I know nothing about the book or its credibility, but and obviously the same level of fear doesn't exist now between the two countries as during the Cold War. But I'm curious if you see any parallels between recent events and the Cold War period.
Let me take a couple of questions, and then back there.
You take that.
Ted Rockwell. I'm a Manhattan Project veteran. You were making the point that some of these things that seemed so axiomatic at the time, like one world or none, really have to be re-examined from time to time, and I think that's extremely important. And one that I would like to put in that category is the idea that nuclear power and nuclear weapons go hand in hand inevitably. And the fact is, if you took a historian's look at the development of nuclear weapons and just pretend that there was never a nuclear power program, I don't think you'd see anything different. Nobody developed weapons from the nuclear power approach. That's just not the easiest way to do it. It's not the sensible way to do it, and nobody does it that way. So that if there was no such thing as nuclear power, if it had been forbidden from the beginning, it wouldn't have changed the Cold War weaponry development at all, as far as I can see.
Michael Staker from the American Patent Institute. I have a question for Robert Furman. Was curious as to whether your job as calming down the scientists, did you feel that you had a two-edged sword in that if you came up with enough information to calm them down, that you might dampen their enthusiasm for the project?
No, I don't think so. The war was going on at a great pace. If we could just get the scientists to go back to work instead of worrying about the bomb, we would have accomplished a great deal. I just don't believe that they would have slowed down at all. But couple that with the fact that maybe you're thinking is that the Army was trying to manage a scientific team made up of scientists who really are not built to understand how the Army works. So we would, in this effort to try to calm them down, I had to act like a scientist and work with them in order to get them on my side, really. There's a lot of friction there between the two, and somehow it worked, but this might amuse you, but it's something occurred to me about another matter, and that is I was on the high seas on the Indianapolis when the bomb was exploded, and we talked. I had this doctor with me who was measuring the bomb for radiation. That is, he was measuring it when he wasn't asleep. He took sleeping pills and he was asleep 21 hours a day. But anyway, we talked about how would we know that the bomb worked. And we decided that if when we got to Tinian, if we were locked up, then it didn't work.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, as far as the new Cold War, I mean, obviously there are parallels, but I'm one of those who doesn't think it's helpful to constantly talk about a new Cold War. The fact that there might be bad relations between the U.S. and Russia, there are bad relations between countries all the time. I mean, the Cold War, to my mind, was a very specific international circumstance where you had an essential existential disagreement about the nature of the international order, the legitimacy of the division of Europe, Germany, and various other things. Bad relations between countries happen all the time. To simply say it's a new Cold War, when simply countries disagree, or there's nothing that essentially says that Russia and the U.S. disagree about the legitimacy of how Europe is set up or their borders. Whereas the Cold War, did reflect that. And so, I just think it confuses the matter. I mean, obviously, publishers and editors are always going to put it in headlines, but I don't think it helps thinking. As far as power, it's a fascinating counterfactual. I'm not a nuclear physicist, so I don't claim to know. I would only wonder whether that's as true for other countries as in the United States, where you had an existing atomic weapons program. But for other countries, you certainly had a process where nuclear technology began with power generation. You had trainings of generations of physicists and engineers to become familiar, and then arguably that gravitated towards an expertise that could be employed with weapons. I mean, one fascinating thing in the history of the nuclear age is that the Soviets were very cautious about nuclear proliferation, whereas Eisenhower in December 1953 launched Atoms for Peace, where he made it a major tenet of U.S. foreign policy to spread nuclear technology, allegedly with sufficient safeguards. Now, some of the beneficiaries of Atoms for Peace, India to take one example, ended up using it for peaceful and not so peaceful nuclear explosions. So can one say universally that there was no connection? I imagine it varied from country to country.
All right, well, thank you so much. I'm sorry, we're going to